Once the Altro Suprema safety flooring has been conditioned, set out and installed, the welding of the flooring joints can be done. Make sure all the required tools and PPE are available and well maintained. To weld Altro Suprema, Altro recommend the use of a special weld nozzle. This nozzle is known as an anti-glaze nozzle. It can be seen here on the left and is identified by its thinner air outlet. The general welding process is the same for Altro Suprema as it is with standard flooring, but the use of the anti-glaze nozzle reduces the risk of overheating the material to the left and right of the weld, which can glaze the clear coat wear layer. Occasionally, when welding Altro Suprema, an effect known as dusting can be seen either side of the weld. This is simply a residue of the manufacturing process that can be wiped away once the weld is complete, leaving it in a perfect condition. The edges of the flooring to be welded need to be double cut so that the two welded edges are clean and tight together. This can be done before the floor is secured into place on the subfloor or afterwards. If the flooring has been stuck to the subfloor with an adhesive, then this adhesive needs to be allowed to cure fully before the welding is done. Wet adhesive can contaminate the weld, making the weld ineffective. If the Altro flooring being used is an adhesive-free one, such as Altro Cantata or Altro Express Lay, then this flooring can be welded as soon as the material has been installed. Grooving is essential on most vinyl flooring. This groove gives the weld rod the maximum surface area to weld to, so giving a full-strength welded joint. The groove should centre along the butted flooring sheets and be to a depth of at least 3/4 of the flooring thickness. Use a long straight edge to make sure the groove is straight and consistent. If there is more than one weld needed in an installation, careful consideration needs to be given to the order in which these welds are done. If welds meet at any point, the weld that joins into the other weld should be done first, and the crossing weld done after this spur. Ensure that the weld rod is a genuine Altro one and is of the correct colour for the flooring. Once the flooring has been fully installed, the welding can take place. It is vital to carry out a test weld on a piece of the flooring. The temperature and speed of travel needed to gain a quality weld will vary depending on the temperature of the floor and the air temperature, as well as the site voltage. Use a flooring offcut and secure it in place so a test weld can be done. This will establish the temperature and speed needed to generate a successful weld. Take a short test length of the weld rod and trim the end at an angle of 45 degrees. This cut needs to leave the longer edge to the outside of the weld rod curve. Once the weld gun has reached temperature, feed the weld rod into the nozzle opening with the curve taking the weld rod in an upward direction. Then preheat the end of the weld rod by moving it in and out of the weld gun's airstream 3 times. Once warmed through, place the nozzle along with the preheated weld rod at the start of the weld and apply gentle pressure, ensuring that the weld rod sits in the groove. Once the weld rod is in place, pull the weld gun towards you at the desired speed whilst feeding the weld rod through the nozzle to keep the weld rod in place until it is fully connected with the flooring. Once the weld has been established, there is no need to continue to feed the weld rod and it can be left to travel through the nozzle unaided. At the end of the weld, place your finger on the weld rod to hold it in position and lift the weld gun away from the floor and let the remaining weld rod flow freely through and out of the nozzle and put the weld gun to one side. Signs that the weld is successful at this stage is a small wake line that can be seen either side of the weld rod. This shows that the weld is fusing nicely between the weld rod and flooring. If this wake line is not seen on both sides, the weld will not have taken and will be weak, will fail and may pull out easily. If this is the case, as seen here, the temperature needs to be increased or the speed of travel needs to be reduced. If the wake line can be seen, but there are scorch marks either side of the weld, then the temperature is too high and should be reduced, or the speed of travel should be increased. In order to get the best possible finish to a weld, the weld needs to be trimmed in a 2-step process. Whilst the weld is still warm, take the sledge and place it over the end of the weld just behind the loose end of the weld rod. Then place the sharp spatula into the sledge and slide the spatula and sledge back along the weld, leaving the weld rod about 0.5 millimeter proud of the floor surface. Once the weld has fully cooled, using the spatula only, apply firm pressure and retrim the weld flush with the floor surface. Once the optimum speed and temperature have been determined, cut enough of the weld rod to complete the distance to be welded. Welds that go from skirting to skirting will need to be done in 2 passes, as it is not possible to weld into a skirting, as the weld gun will not be at the correct position. Follow the same procedure as with the test weld. Once the first part of the weld is complete, trimmed and finished, the second and final part of this weld can be done. Using the same process as the previous length of weld, start at the opposite skirting and work towards the tail of the first weld. When the tail of the first weld is arrived at, continue 15 to 20 millimeters into the tail of the first weld and overlap it. Finish and trim this shorter length of weld in the same way as the first weld using the 2-step process. Where 2 welds intersect, the spur should be done first. When finishing this weld, where it meets the joint that crosses its path, the spatula should be used to shield the crossing cut. This protects the flooring from the heat of the welding gun. Finish and trim this weld using the 2-step process, being careful not to damage the flooring material at the end of the spur. Make sure that the crossing groove is clear to accept the weld rod, and then make the weld. Once complete, use the 2-step trimming process to finish the weld flush with the floor.